Charles, Bill, Craig, Shane, and we have some gentlemen, I haven't been introduced yet, but we have two gentlemen from SIMPA here to do a little presentation also that are on the agenda. So looking at the consent agenda from last meeting, does anyone have anything they want to pull from the minutes or the payments report that they want to discuss? Otherwise, if we do not, then...
This payments report from last month or from when?
This would be from period through March 2022?
Yep.
Yeah,
Sorry.
through March.
I had two questions on that, but I don't know
March.
if Mike's not here, maybe.
Well, Mike's not here, so I mean, you're welcome to ask the questions, because then we have it documented, and we can always follow up on
And
it.
again, it's just curiosity. There is a charge from the Water Conservation Service. I was just trying to figure out what the Water Conservation Service is. Seems like it might be something the PUC knows about.
No idea.
I don't know.
Water conservation, is that working with the county? Is that part of the,
I don't know enough to answer on camera.
okay.
Off camera?
We're both, we're both, where's that at?
It's page 3.
Okay,
I'll have to follow up on that.
I'll just so I know what we're looking at here.
Bottom entry. And, like,
Am I on the right page?
That's, oh, maybe the page number is different.
Oh, that's page 2, that's right.
Yeah, but it's a different page 3.
Oh,
It's, let's see.
page 3, the second page 3. There's page 1, page 3. Changes that. 163. I see what you're looking at. There's a lot of pages there.
It's not on page 3.
That's 52. It must be this one right here.
Yep, see Water Conservation Service.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we'll have to follow up. We'll have to follow up on that. I'm not sure.
And then one other thing I was curious about was what does Schweitzer Engineering Lab do for us? Maybe water testing? I was trying to figure out what that might be, but it's a lot of money for water testing.
Not a clue.
They make electrical relays.
Oh, is that
Yeah,
the
that's the
Schweitzer?
new-
What page? I just saw that.
The new switching,
Is that
probably.
part of that switch?
Yeah.
The switches we installed
Maybe.
at the substation? We bought 3 and we installed the 1. That,
I would not be surprised. I mean, what do I know? I know Schweitzer is,
Yeah, you're
SEO
probably right.
Labs, or I mean, Schweitzer Engineering, that they make electrical relays. So
Yeah.
Yeah, we
I suspect
replaced,
what
we
that is.
replaced
this
some
one,
big
the
relays.
that payment of
24,000, yeah.
24,000? Okay.
It says operating supplies, so it would make
Operating
sense.
supplies, general.
We
yeah.
bought something from them.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, we can check on both of those.
okay.
So, want clarification on those. We can still approve the consent agenda, but we can ask for clarification on those 2 questions for next meeting.
Sure.
Okay. So we just need a motion to approve the consent agenda.
Also move.
Second.
Second, okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Motion consent agenda approved. Second item on the agenda is a visit from 2 members of SIMPA. So thank you for coming, and please introduce yourselves. I'm sorry I haven't been introduced to you, but
Yeah.
go ahead, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. I'm Dave Geschwin. I'm the Executive Director and CEO for SIMPA. I'm with Joe Hoffman. Joe is our Director of Agency and Government Relations and Chief External Affairs Officer. So between the 2 of us, we're going to try to give you kind of a simple 101 or a version of what we kind of put together for an orientation session for folks that are new to our members. So maybe before we launch, I guess I just want to maybe get a sense of how much time you want us to kind of focus on, so we don't take more time going through it than you want to hear.
I think we want to finish before midnight.
Well, we can hang.
We want to finish before 5:15 for sure.
Oh, well, then no problem.
I have to
We'll keep-
walk my dogs, so, you know.
Well, no, that's all right. No, we can do this in probably 30 to 60 minutes. We'll shoot for shorter than 60, and, depending on your questions. So we'll,
So, can we interrupt with questions? Is that okay?
yeah, I
Okay.
was just going to say.
So I'll start right away and interrupt. I've had several people ask me, why is Grand Marais in Simpa? And what's the history of that? Do you know?
Yeah.
that?
I do. No,
Okay.
that predated me, but from what I understand, there were two agencies that came together, and this will save me a little bit of time, but SIMPA was formed in 1977. The original 13 members of SIMPA came together. Well, I'll tell you what, why don't we go to that?
Okay,
Well,
you're going to cover that.
I'm going to
in-
cover that here pretty
Okay.
quickly. So, so we gave you paper copies of what we want to talk through, so you can follow on the paper copy, and I'll just kind of talk through so you'll know where we are. And Patrick, I suppose you can probably advance that.
Trying to.
So there's what if you go back to just today's topics, this is what we're
Okay.
going to cover at a high level, and stop anytime and ask questions about any of this. So we'll talk a little bit about governance, the next bullet down, what we call SIMPA 2.0, which is an effort that we went through about 2 years ago to kind of take a look at the future and envision where do we think the agency is heading with input from the members. That's how we operate. And then we'll kind of cover the various major departments of the agency and how we operate. So the next one will give you a more of a direct answer to the question. So this is kind of who we are. So SIMPA is in the industry considered a joint action agency, and joint action basically means that we sell wholesale power to our 18 member cities, one of which is Grand Marais. And you can see here that first bullet saying the agency came together in 1977, and that was a result of some legislation that was passed in Minnesota in 1976 that really allowed for the creation of joint action agencies. So these cities back then were worried about the source of their power supply. We were in the middle of the energy crisis, oil embargo sorts of times. So they recognized that, okay, we can create economies of scale by working together. So there were 13 cities that were part of what the original Southern Minnesota group represented, and then there were 5 cities working together. Grand Marais was one of those. There was a very small joint action agency called UMPA, the United Minnesota Municipal Power Agency, I believe is what UMPA stood for back then. So those two agencies, 13 cities and 5 cities, were kind of separately talking about how to get together for power supply, or what they should do jointly for power supply. They came together to build a unit that we still have today with Xcel Energy, the Sherco 3 coal-fired generating unit. And then I think it was in 1983 that SIMPA and UMPA decided to merge to go from 13 and 5 into the 18 cities that we have today. And for whatever reason, they decided to keep the name Southern Minnesota Municipal Power Agency. And so that's why Grand Marais is a part of a group with the name Southern Minnesota. So so those original 5, if you just look at our little map there with the lightning bolts, Grand Marais, Mora, Princeton, North Branch, and Litchfield were part of the 5 cities that were part of this UMPA, small joint action agency, that then joined with the other 13 cities in the lower part of the map there. So that's a little bit of how that came together.
So why would there be no cities between Grand Marais and Mora? I mean, like where are all the rest of these cities? They gotta be doing something.
Well, there are cities there. Minnesota's an interesting state in that there are a variety of wholesale providers for other cities, other public power entities in the state of Minnesota. There are other versions of SIMPA. We serve the most electrical load in the state, but there are other smaller versions of us serving Minnesota utilities, and some of the cities between Grand Marais and Mora, I think, buy wholesale power from Minnesota Power. So they're wholesale power customers of Minnesota Power. Kind of the distinction there is Grand Marais and members of any joint action agency have more input and really control in terms of their power supply. If you're buying wholesale from Minnesota Power or Xcel Energy, you probably have a little less control in terms of the mix of your power supply resources. Not to say that that's bad, but I think that's what's going on. So just kind of finishing up on this chart, you can see we have listed what SIMPA provides. So our main function is generation and power supply for our member public power systems. We also have transmission assets because we have to be able to deliver that power to the, basically what I think of as the city gate of our members. So we bring the wholesale power to the edge of our communities, and then our members like Grand Marais and other members, they then distribute the electricity to the retail customers. So we basically have 18 customers that represent our 18 cities. You folks then have all of the retail customers that you serve inside your community. We also provide energy services. Joe will talk a little bit about what we provide in the way of energy services for our members. And then another thing that Joe and his team provide would be legislative and regulatory support. So we get involved both at the national level and at the state level to talk to lawmakers and regulators about policies that they're contemplating so that they understand how it might impact the utility industry and ultimately our customers. So that at the highest level is kind of what we do. We'll go to the next slide here. Sometimes people like to see some numbers just to get a sense of, how big of an entity are we talking about. So there's a few facts and figures here on this SIMPA at a glance. We have 45 employees, most of which are located in our Rochester office. That's where our main headquarters is, in Rochester. If you're kind of thinking about how big the utility is, one of the ways that we compare ourselves in the utility industry is by peak demand. So last summer we peaked at 540 megawatts in June when we had a heat wave down, at least in our part of the state, back in June. Just for a point of comparison, I think Grand Marais, I believe, is a winter peaking system, so there's more electrical load here in winter than there is in the summertime, which is not atypical for this part of the state. And I think Grand Marais probably peaks maybe just under 5 megawatts, 4.5 to 5 megawatts size range. And total revenues, you can see there, retail customers of all of our members, and a combined population when we roll all 18 cities together of just over 250,000 residents of the 18 cities.
Just curious, when you say peak load 540 megawatts, how's that compared to, say, Minnesota Power or Excel?
Well, MP, I guess I don't know what their peak is. Excel is probably greater than 5,000 megawatts, for example. So 540 megawatts is still somewhat smallish, depending on kind of who you're comparing it to.
Right.
Excel is thousands of megawatts. Yeah.
Okay.
Minnesota Power is smaller than Excel, but they're probably also up there.
A couple thousand, maybe.
Yeah, I would think so.
Yeah.
Most of their load, I think, is taconite related load. Yeah.
You're probably one of the few organizations that does $250 million a year with 45 people. That's impressive.
One thing you learn when you're in this industry is that the dollars are big.
Yeah,
It
no
is
kidding.
surprising. That's exactly right. When I look at $260 million of revenue, right, with 45 staff people, yeah, it's like, how does that even happen? But it's the way the industry works. Yeah. So let me talk a little bit about governance, because Grand Marais has a role in our governance, as do all of our members. So we have member representatives, and then I'll talk in a second about the board. So all of our members designate a member representative to interface with the agency in an official capacity, and Mike Roth is the official member representative for Grand Marais, and I think Shane is the alternate for any SIMPA matters. And occasionally the member representatives get involved in terms of certain decisions. The member representatives vote for the board members, for example, every year, and I'll talk about that in just a second. And then there are also a few things where the member representatives vote instead of a board vote. So let's talk about the board for a second here. We do have a 7-member board, so not every member sits on the board. And the way the agency was set up from the very beginning, the 3 largest members of the agency, they have an automatic seat on the board. So currently that's Rochester, Austin, and Owatonna. They're the largest by size served by SIMPA, so they have an automatic seat on the board. And then there's 4 other board seats that we call at-large board seats, and each one of those expires per year, so there's a 4-year term. So every year, all of the members are voting on that expiring at-large seat. So any member can serve on the board of directors if they're interested and get elected. The vast majority of the agency's governance decisions that require board action or formal approval outside of staff go to the board. So a rate decision, that's a board decision, contract approval, that sort of thing, that's a board decision. But the member representatives do get involved in approving debt. So if we're developing a big power supply project and need to issue debt to fund that, then the board has to approve that, and the member representatives then separately vote to approve that. Just because I think back in the day it was viewed that if the agency's going to issue debt, and of course we set rates to recover debt, then we want all of the members to have a say in that. So we don't do debt issuances very often, fortunately, but when we do, we need to bring that to all of the member representatives for a vote and approval. I mentioned here the power sales contracts. It's the way, particularly when we're talking about long-term debt, it's kind of like when you get a home mortgage. Sometimes you want to get a long term on that to spread the payments out to keep the rate impact as minimal as possible. So typically, this industry works on long-term debt. Very frequently, you're talking 30-year bonds. So we have long-term contracts because it's the contracts that really provide the backstop for how the agency collects revenue to then pay back the bondholders. So we have long-term agreements. We have agreements that go to 2050 for 16 members. 2 of our members did not extend to those agreements to 2050, and those are right now, absent any changes. And there may be some changes that are in the works that we'll see, but 2 of our members' agreements will expire in 2030. All of the original contracts, when they were signed back when the agency was formed and they decided to go with Xcel and build the big coal plant, those contracts went out to 2030. And then in the late, kind of the 2008 and 2009 timeframe, the agency was looking to have to add some other smaller generating plants to cover the anticipated growth and the actual growth that had occurred in order to be able to finance those new smaller power plants with bonds that were not artificially short in term. There was a discussion about extending those agreements to 2050, and that's how we ended up with most of the members extending to 2050. 2 members that didn't extend, Rochester and Austin. I think they thought that they were big enough to perhaps be able to do their own thing. I think Rochester will probably not do anything with its contract and allow it to expire in 2030. We're having some conversations about Austin about some ways to continue to work together after 2030. So, but Grand Marais was one of the entities that it decided to extend the agreement with the agency to 2050. So SIMPA has a responsibility to provide for all of Grand Marais' wholesale power needs out through 2050, and 15 other members.
So the idea with these power sales contracts, simply it's a commitment by the cities to continue buying power from SIMPA, right? There's not a fixed rate, I'm assuming, because that can be adjusted.
Oh yeah, the rates, we'll talk a little bit about the rates. The rates are not fixed, right? It's really a two-way commitment. So the cities commit to buy all of their power supply through the agency, and the agency then has an obligation to provide all of the power supply that the members need.
Yeah.
Right. And then really it's that commitment that it provides the basis for going out and financing the resources, the generating units and the transmission assets necessary to make that happen. Yeah.
Rochester, you're going to build their own power plant?
Well, that's a long story. They're working
It's
on
okay.
it, and we will potentially be involved in that through some other arrangements, but it's way too early, to know where that's going to go. But they're working on it. Yeah, yeah. Okay, well, we'll move on to the next one here. So I mentioned that when the members first came together, one of the first things that they did, really their first big project, was to jointly build a coal-fired unit power plant with then NSP, Northern States Power, now Xcel Energy. So, and that happened. That unit went online in 1987, and the SIMPA owns 41% of Unit 3 up at Sherco in Becker, Minnesota. Xcel owns 59% of Unit 3. That unit went online in 1987. That's believe it or not, still the newest coal-fired unit in Minnesota. It's the newest and probably the last coal-fired unit that will be built in Minnesota. I don't see that happening anymore, but it's still a valuable resource for us today. But in talks with Xcel, and partially because of the change in the contract that we have with Rochester in 2030, SIMPA and Xcel mutually agreed that we can see the end of the line for Sherco 3. So 2030, was what we were all focusing on for the planned retirement date for Unit 3. So those conversations started several years ago, and it really gave us a chance to step back and say, okay, well, that SIMPA was kind of formed around the construction of Sherco 3. It's since really morphed into much more than just Sherco 3, but that's really the foundation of it. And now we're looking at the retirement of Sherco 3. What direction do the members want the agency to go with where future power supply is going to come from? So that resulted in what we call our SIMPA 2.0 strategic initiative that we worked through with the members and the board. I think we unveiled it. We had a press release, I think it was early February of 2020. And a month later, nobody cared about that. Everybody was focused on the pandemic. So what was big news to us was quickly eclipsed by everybody's concerns over the pandemic, understandably. But let me just kind of talk quickly through the elements of SIMPA 2.0. And this is really, a lot of this is the forward look of where we think things are headed. But some of it is kind of where we're going in the near term too. So kind of the up front there is the plan to retire Sherco 3. And as it says, there's cease-owning coal generation after 2030. So the current plan is Sherco 3 will retire in 2030, and then we'll need to replace it with something to continue to provide the energy needs of the members. And we think that that will be significantly done with wind and solar resources. Renewables will provide most of the replacement energy for Sherco. The mix is roughly to be determined, but we think it'll roughly be 50-50 wind and solar. When we start to look at, okay, well, what does that mean for whatever level of carbon-free generation we would have on the system, we think that will allow us to say we'll be at least 80% carbon-free in 2030. It'll probably be higher than that. And we will have reduced carbon emissions in 2030, when that happens, by nearly 90% compared to 2005 levels. So significant differences in terms of what the agency's future resource mix would look like compared to really where we are today and where we've been. However, we think natural gas and diesel generation, kind of like the plant that is here in Grand Marais, will continue to play a role. We know that renewable generation with today's technologies is still intermittent. So when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining, sort of stuff, you need to have resources. So we have other members that have diesel generation plants that are very similar to the plant here that we expect will need to operate very limited hours, but when they're needed, they're needed. So we're trying to be as transparent as possible that we still see that technology probably as a bridge technology, but there's a role for that in the near term anyway, that we continue to want to be able to support with the members. You know, we buy all of the output of the plant here in Grand Marais when it has to operate. We pay for the fuel costs when that generation operates. So we know those sorts of agreements are very important to our members, and we want to continue to support those because those plants support local reliability.
So that's 80% carbon-free 2030, so that means 80% of SIMPA's power is coming from wind and solar, and then 20% is coming from gas and diesel?
Well, no, not necessarily. So we're trying to be very conservative with this number so that we could defend it. So a big portion of our future energy will come from this MISO market that I'm going to talk to in a little bit. So if you're kind of buying economic energy off of the market, it's very difficult to know what's the mix of that. If I'm buying somebody else's surplus, is that from natural gas? Is that their surplus wind? So we try to take a conservative estimate that if we're buying purchases when we think it's cheaper to do that, maybe in the middle of the night, for example, if we know if we have future solar panels and they're not producing, we're going to have to supplement from the market to serve the load. So we don't know what that is, so we're not saying it's all renewable. So we're assuming there's a fossil element to some of those future purchases, and that's why that 80% is not a higher number. That's why I say it'll probably be at least that. It's really a function of, well, what's the future energy market renewable mix? That's a little bit out of our control.
So when Sherco 3 closes, is SIMPA buying all their power off the grid?
No. We have renewable plants today. We have wind farms, and we have a small solar project, and we have a methane generator. So we have other renewable resources that we own or control. Right. And we expect to add more. Right. And those are some conversations we're having right now to look at developing those future renewable projects. Let's see, let me just kind of keep moving here. There's a few other points in here. I won't necessarily highlight them today.
Actually, can you go back to that last one? I had a question on the new technologies.
You bet.
And I just read an article, you probably saw it too in the New York Times, about Hawaii, which is in a unique position, obviously, for
Yeah.
not being able to take advantage of MISO. And they've incentivized their utilities to accelerate, rooftop solar, small wind, and battery storage on a residential level in Hawaii. And I couldn't quite, I went to the Hawaii Public Utilities site, and I couldn't quite get through the verbiage on,
Yeah.
and to figure out exactly how they're incentivizing it, but somehow they're paying the utilities to encourage that.
I wonder where the money's coming from
Yeah,
for that.
well, of course, people get the usual incentives, federal and state incentives for installing that in their home, but I'm not sure, but to me, that was very interesting. As you heard my background before we
Yeah,
started the
right.
taping, and
Right.
so small generation, my generation was up close to 85%. And when I toured the coal plant in Taconite Harbor when that was operating, I asked the operating engineer at the end, "What's your overall efficiency?" And he said,
30?
just under 20.
Oh, really?
That was an old plant.
Yeah, okay.
And he said, and then that's before transmission.
Yeah.
So by the time you get out, and so it seems to me that there's a real opportunity to, are you open to that? Are you open to Grand Marais starting to produce more power and incentivizing people to do that?
Well, the agreement, kind of yes and no. In terms of customers is putting on their own residential panels, if they want to own their own panels and put them on their roof, that's out there today.
Yeah.
If it's the city putting in generation, that's part of that commitment that we talked about where the cities are committing to basically buy their power and energy from the agency. Now, that doesn't mean we have a program, for example, where the agency helps subsidize local solar installations that a member may want to put in. We still buy the output, but it's at a price that I think helps subsidize a local installation to kind of help with what you're talking about. We talked about this with the board and the members, and the consensus was that we believe that utility scale projects still provide an economy of scale that you don't get with just individual residential installations. And the challenge with residential installations under the current regulatory regime is that there is a subsidy that's provided, to the extent that you're providing a subsidy for somebody to put a rooftop system on their own house, where does that subsidy come from? Well, it comes from all of the customers of the utility system. So those folks that maybe can't or don't have the ability to put on their own residential system arguably are subsidizing the installation that somebody else is. So
For some policy ends, but the subsidy aside, what I'm talking about really is less me putting solar panels on my house and selling it to you
Mhm.
than having, 100 small producers in Grand Marais that would actually sell to each other or supply each other. So the power wouldn't go to you and then come back. It would stay here, but would reduce the need to buy from you.
Well,
And how we do that without, obviously, it's not in your best interest.
Right.
to-
Right.
To cut yourself off from us.
Right.
But from a policy point of view and an efficiency point of view, it kind of makes sense. And I'm just wondering if that's something you're thinking about for the future, and if you've looked at Hawaii's model to see if there's a way you could be incentivized to help make that happen.
I probably can't speak to whatever Hawaii's doing. We're still trying to work with our members to provide, the renewable generation that we think, makes sense for the future, and do it in a way that we think is the most cost-effective way for the communities. So incentivizing current customers to kind of cut the local utility out of the mix is probably not something that we're
Kind of
pursuing.
sets up a tension, though, I think, between the communities you serve as that technology comes in. Really, the reason for centralized power plants and big transmission lines was that was the only economic model that worked
Right.
back in the day, because there was no way to. But now, with modern computing power, you really could set up a network in Grand Marais where it fed itself, where people shared with each other and had small storage on site and could, you could use that. It would make it much more robust, much more secure, and cheaper, probably, in the long run. So just something I
Yeah.
suggest to you. I know the utilities are edgy about this.
Yeah.
And in California, they fought it tooth and nail, but it's one of those things, it's kind of like the personal computer. I remember people saying to me, oh, personal computer will never work. It's going to be mainframes forever, And I think this is going to kind of come from the bottom up.
Yeah, I think clearly
And-
costs are improving on that. I think to some degree, they still need transmission lines and distribution lines. And I think the challenge is, are there subsidies that are out there to incent that sort of development of technology, and where should those subsidies be funded, or who should fund that?
Well, maybe it doesn't need a subsidy as time goes on. For instance, you might find yourself in a situation where a neighborhood in Grand Marais gets together on their own, just says, you know what, we're cutting the cord with the city, and these 20 houses are gonna do their own power thing.
Well, yeah, I mean,
Now,
someday that could.
That's a risk to you, that could happen.
Yep. And I'd say it's a risk to the city utility as well. Right. Yep.
So, just an interesting topic, I think, that at some point will play a role in the future. It's probably not here now, but probably not too far away either.
Yeah, and,
Just,
and there's,
based on my experience as a small producer, it's not that hard to do, honestly.
I think there's customers out there that would probably love to try to tackle that project, and I think there's customers out there that want nothing to do with tackling that
Sure.
sort of project. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, ready to flip to the next one?
Are we gonna continue, or?
Yes, yeah, there we go, thanks, Patrick.
Programs.
So the last slide here on SIPA 2.0, we do have a variety of customer programs that get beyond just the kind of the basic power supply and transmission functions. We do have a variety of energy efficiency programs. Maybe Joe will talk a little bit about that, but that would be things like incentivizing customers for LED light bulbs, helping the customers, whether it's residential customers or commercial or industrial customers, consume electricity as efficiently as possible. We have programs that we offer with the members to help with rebates and education related to those energy efficiency programs. We also are kind of taking a hard look at beneficial electrification. That seems to be a term that we hear a lot more about today, where maybe we're able to help promote things like maybe electric vehicles would be a good example, where from a broader emissions perspective, to the extent people aren't consuming gasoline and the emissions associated with direct combustion of gasoline, but through electric vehicles and more efficient power plant generation, we can convert transportation to electric vehicles, beneficial electrification. We're taking a look at our role there, and we have several years ago, we introduced the EV charging network, and I believe Grand Marais has a Simpa fast charger and I think 2 level 2 chargers in town. We put chargers like that in all of our 18 member communities, or made them available to all of the 18 communities, to try to help deal with range anxiety and just overall adoption of electric vehicles. Let's see. We have a statement in our SIMPA 2.0 initiative about maintaining competitive rates. I'll have a graph there coming up that's showing kind of where our rates compare to an inflation-adjusted rate, but we think we can do all of this and keep our rates at or below inflation. Interesting, when we put this initiative together, inflation was not at 8% plus like we have seen. But we still think we can do all of this for at or below inflationary sorts of costs. And we changed our logo in the process of doing that. You folks probably care less about that. That was kind of a big deal when we were talking with our members to get an updated logo.
It's a lovely logo.
Well, thanks.
But just before you leave that page, you have a bullet there, air source heat pumps. What's SIMPA doing to encourage the expanded use of those?
You want to talk, do you know enough to talk about that, Joe?
Well, sure. Largely, we have a rebate incentive program to encourage customers to switch fuel from natural gas to electric heat. And we've seen,
Like individual customers?
that's correct,
Yeah.
yep. And so that is a rebate program that is actually branded right through Grand Marais Public Utilities here. And we've seen significant improvement in efficiencies of air source heat pumps.
Right.
And also with mini split systems, if you're familiar with those as well, a lot of individuals that might have hot water heat in their home are looking to switch over to mini splits for air conditioning and even some winter heating as well. And so we offer rebates to our customers. I think I even have a few specifics on that. I believe that our heat pump rebates are a little more customized, and so, but we do have an energy services representative that works here in Grand Marais, probably up here maybe once a month or so, Nancy. Every other month. And we also have a website where we detail what those rebates are, but I'd be happy to get some of that information to you specifically if you're interested.
Yeah, it'd be great. And I mean, Shane and I have talked a little bit about this. One of the big barriers with these air source heat pumps is that it requires a upfront capital investment on the part of the house. And so the rebates are great.
Yeah.
Once you get installed, but if people don't have the money to put the thing in, that's a big barrier.
That is correct. And while the rebates help, they are just a small portion of that upfront capital cost to install the system.
Right.
That is correct.
Have you thought about any ways to help people overcome that hump?
That's a good question. No, but that's an interesting idea. If there's some other way that we could partner with an organization to help spread that cost out. No, I do like that idea, though.
Yeah, well, maybe
Always
we
open to
maybe we talk
suggestions.
later about it. I'm interested. I mean, the main goal is to get off of carbon, right?
That's certainly, yeah, one of the goals are to use electricity as efficiently as possible, right? Yeah. Well, let's see. Next slide, Patrick. So let me just we'll kind of cover some of the transition in our generation mix that we've talked a little bit about. So just to kind of give you a sense of what we have on the system today. The upper left-hand picture is the Sherco generating station. We have 41% of that building on the far left of those 3 boiler buildings. That's the unit that was built in 1987. The other 2 units, Excel owns 100% of those. Those were, units 1 and 2 were built in the 70s.
Are they still operating?
They are still operating, but unit 1 will retire in 2026, and unit 2 will retire in 2023. So it's current schedule. So those units are slowly, really all 3 units will be phased out over the next roughly 8 years. Right. We have other pictures there. We have natural gas, an engine plant, one in Owatonna, one in Fairmont. Those were some of the smaller projects that I mentioned were the basis for the contract extensions out to 2050. We have 2 large wind farms, 200 megawatt total nameplate capacity in 2 wind farms that we have. We have a small solar project, 5 megawatt solar project in Owatonna. That's our first venture into utility scale solar. And then we have member engine diesel plants like the one here in Grand Marais that are under contract to the agency under long-term agreements. And then we have a small landfill methane generator in Mora that we installed and purchased the output of that. And that's considered renewable generation as well. Next slide kind of shows the transition of where our portfolio has been, kind of where it is now and where it's going. You kind of look at the rings there. You can see the years on the ring. Our first wind project went in service in 2009. And that represents that green bar addition on the 2009 ring compared to 2008, where most of our energy did come from coal. You can see where we're at now in 2021, where a fair chunk of our energy comes from renewable generation. We have over 200 megawatts of wind generation on the system today. And then we put 2031 up here, but when Sherco goes away in 2030, we will have no coal-fired generation on the system. And then this assumes planned renewable additions that came out of that strategic planning effort. And you can see that the vast majority of the energy we expect to have on our system should come from renewable resources. There is some small level of fossil generation, primarily fuel oil and natural gas. Up at the top of that, we don't expect the energy production from that to be significant, but it is necessary to maintain reliability. And we have reliability obligations that we have to demonstrate as a utility operating part of a broader power pool that will require us to have resources that can generate capacity when necessary.
You said 80% renewables by 2030. This looks like 95.
This graph does not, this just looks at what would be the SIMPA, and you're right, I mean, it's a little bit of a distinction. That this graph just looks at of the generation that we would own And we excluded the market purchases from this.
Ah,
That's why it looks like it's a higher percentage.
It's not what
but
you would sell, it's what you're producing.
It's what we would produce, right? It's not what we would buy that would
Right,
have this
buy in.
unknown component or estimated component of, say, fossil generation in it.
So this is kind of the portion that we can control.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
and speak to.
And of the, what, so this is like 75% then maybe of what your SIMPA's output is? What's represented in this graph? I mean,
Yeah, what percentage purchases of the total mix would we have? Is that,
yeah, I mean, if you're saying 95% of what SIMPA's going to produce is.
yeah, maybe it is
green.
15 to 20%-ish, if I remember the numbers correctly.
You're sort
It
of
would come from
guessing.
the market.
You're
Oh.
sort of guessing, aren't you? I mean, that's the future, right? So,
Yeah.
we
Right.
don't know for sure, but
Right,
Right.
right.
make an educated guess.
A lot of it's based on economics.
Yeah.
Right.
But most then, 75, 80, maybe 85% of what
What we
is
would
sent out to customers, you can kind of
We
say.
would control,
yeah.
right. That's kind of why we say the 80%.
Yeah.
In that SIMPA 2.0
Yep. Yep.
communication piece, right. I mean, an example, and I don't have a graph of it, but it is kind of stark when you see it graphically. So if we have significant amounts of solar on our system, for example, we know in the middle of the night that production goes to zero. Now, maybe there will be battery technology in the future that's of the scale and of the discharge duration that will allow us to have it, and if that's the case, we will. But if you look at the solar going away, say, in the middle of the night, yes, you'll have some wind generation when the wind is blowing, but you can't add more solar to get more production at night because it's still going to be zero when the sun isn't shining. So there's going to be periods of time at night, for example, during off-peak periods when we're going to need to rely on the broader market to provide or turn on a little bit of fossil generation if we believe that we can't get it from the market or it's significantly cheaper to do that than to take it from the market. So that's a little bit of this transitional stage that we're in where we don't have viable utility scale storage right now that can take some of the surplus renewable generation from the middle of the day, store it for maybe periods of time when you have weather fronts or even 12 hours of no daylight as you go through the nighttime sort of thing. This next slide, there we go. This kind of shows the mix today and a decade from now in terms of capacity and the distinction that we make in the utility industry. When we talk about energy, that's really how do we expect to run the generators that we have? Where is the energy coming from 24 hours a day? This really just looks at the nameplate ratings of the generators. So if we had to run everything, what percentage of what we have is shown here by fuel type? So, today, if we just look at the nameplate capability of the resources on our system, that's the left graph. And then when we look to the future, take coal out of the mix, what does that look like on a nameplate capability? A little bit of a different distinction between, where's all the energy coming from? This is really more, what are you capable of doing? The other graph was, what do you think you're going to be doing in terms of how you're going to be operating those?
Oh, I see. So despite the fact renewables building 54% of this graph, you're saying, well, we think, the graph from the previous page, we're going to produce 95%, but that's because most of the time you're not going to need
Right.
these.
Most of the
these
time,
other
you're
three.
not going to be running fuel oil or natural gas.
Yeah.
The demand side management, that represents kind of the load that, we're incentivizing customers or helping them to consume more efficiently. So that's really load that doesn't even show up on the system because people have, high efficiency motors or drives or LED light bulbs instead of less efficient devices. So we have to calculate what we think those savings are, and that's what that demand side management triangle or
So
slice represents.
What's your incentive to incentivize customers to reduce demand?
Oh,
Because when I look around, I was, again, from my experience, I was intimately involved with every single
Yeah.
watt that went through my system, right? Because it was,
Yeah.
and so I lived a life that most people don't. Most people turn the lights on,
Right.
and they don't care, except to complain when they pay the bill. But when I look around Grand Marais and everywhere in this country, I see unbelievable waste of electricity everywhere. Just phenomenal waste.
Yeah.
And boy, it just seems like a resource we could really tap, but again, why would you put yourselves out of business? You know, so
Well-
what's your incentive for?
You could get another job, right?
Well,
Come on.
so I have a quote on one of my slides, and I'll
Yeah, maybe
mention
I'm
that.
getting
It's
into your
that-
presentation.
Well, no,
and-
well, we're
okay.
here, and we don't have to follow this
Okay,
order, that's
okay.
fine, yeah, but there is no cheaper or cleaner power than that which we don't,
Yeah,
we as in
exactly.
Grand Marais or SEMPA, that we don't have to produce. And so our incentive right there is that we are required by MISO to be able to show the max capacity of all of our customers together, and we have to show how we would meet that with our generation, correct, Dave?
Yeah,
Yeah,
we'll explain,
it's-
you guys, we haven't explained MISO yet, that's on the next one, but we'll
That's
talk
the
about
energy
that.
market. And by having demand-side management, which would be our rebate program, we basically are saving 13% of our capacity mix that we don't have to build a power plant to cover. And so, since we have to design our electric system, as Grand Marais does as well, to serve your peak loads, so down here might be your coldest day in winter, in Preston might be the hottest day in summer.
I know all about peak load.
Yeah, yeah, and so since we have to design our system, if we can make our peak smaller, it is better for all of our customers.
Yeah.
And we save costs and we build fewer power plants, and so maybe that's the oversimplified answer, but that's my take on
Yeah,
it.
no, that's right,
Yeah.
yeah. I
How
mean,
does how are you structured in terms of the flow of the money? Are you like Minnesota Power, or you're an investor-owned
No,
utility? So you're you're a nonprofit, basically?
right, correct, right. So we don't have investors, we don't have
So you don't really
shareholders.
have a profit incentive
We're not
necessarily,
trying to
except
earn
Try
a-
to keep all 45 people
We're not
working,
paying
but-
dividends, we're not worried about, quarterly earnings, that sort of thing.
All right.
Right.
That helps me to think about
We
it.
have, but effectively our 18 member owners, and
Right.
3 of you represent one of those
Yeah,
18.
yeah.
Right, yep, yep, no return on equity,
Yeah,
none of that.
well, my comment is that, just from my experience with producing my own power for so long, at a higher rate than most people do, is that's job one, is that demand side management. I mean, I had LED bulbs 20 years ago when they first
Did you?
came
Yeah,
out.
right,
I don't want to tell you what I paid for those either, but it
Yeah,
was
I-
worth it. It was worth it.
yeah.
I mean, I was paying $20 a light bulb. and
Well, the alternative is you were gonna have to add more panels.
They paid
or
for themselves,
Get
yeah.
get a bigger generator, and,
Yeah,
and the same thing applies on a utility scale, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Okay, operating in the MISO market, we could spend a day talking about the
MISO.
MISO market, so I'm not going to.
Complicated.
But think of, when we talk about MISO, that's the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator. That is what I would think of as the regional grid operator. Their headquarters are in Carmel, Indiana. But you can see the footprint of MISO. It really goes from Canada down to the Gulf of Mexico. And they operate the regional energy market. They came about in 2005 with the regional energy market. Kind of the distinction that they created when they started operating in the old days, utilities would run their generation to serve their load. And if we had surplus power or a neighbor had surplus power, you would literally get on the phone with their operators and our operators and say, I can sell you 50 megawatts at this price. Do you want it? And they might say, you know what, that's cheaper than I can generate 50 megawatts. Sure, I'll take it. And you would just kind of work together to share your excesses. Now the process is very similar, with the exception that it's all done on computers. Now our operators are typing in and saying, okay, it costs X to run my plant at these output levels. That all goes into a big algorithm that MISO then looks at to determine how they are going to direct the plants to operate to serve the load that we also have to forecast. We type in what we think the loads are going to be for tomorrow, and then MISO tries to identify the most cost-effective way to serve all of those loads. So it still makes sense to own generation because you still want to hedge your market exposure, because in the process of figuring out how to serve all the load, MISO creates market prices that change minute to minute, or, but typically you settle hourly. So hourly, every hour, the price is different. So you want to be able to turn on your own generating units to, in essence, hedge your market price exposure. That's a big part of what we do for the members to try to operate the power plants in this MISO market.
I see you don't mention hydro at all. You're not in the hydro market at all?
No, we have purchased in the past hydro from Manitoba Hydro. We've had a purchase power agreement with them that has since expired. Hydro is not always cheap. I mean, it kind of depends, depending on what you're looking at. You might be better off to get wind generation than hydro generation, but we do not own any hydro generation.
I have a friend who grew up in his grandmother's house, the closest to the dam at Grand Rapids for Manitoba Hydro,
Okay.
a native guy.
Yep.
And he does not have much good to say about that project.
Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, really pretty devastating to that whole
I was
community
gonna
up there.
Yeah,
So I'm kind of glad to hear that you're not hydro, actually.
yeah, okay. Yeah.
From his point of view, he opened my eyes to a whole different way of looking at it, because I just thought, oh, hydropower, renewable,
Right.
it's great,
Right,
but not so great for that community.
right, right. Okay, next up, I won't spend a lot of time on this, other than to say that we do have substantial ownership in transmission and substation assets. I mentioned that we've got to get the power to the members, and one of the ways that we do that is through owning transmission to do that. Our transmission assets are scattered around Minnesota. We work in conjunction with other bigger utilities to build transmission where necessary. I think the agency owns probably over $230 million worth of transmission assets scattered around to get the power to the member systems. Next up, we have just a slide on the rates. You'll have the information here. I won't go through the agency's rate structure. You probably care less about that. That's probably what Mike needs to, focus on, and he understands how the agency bills its members. We do have the last two bullets. We do have some economic development rates that we make available to the members, who then in turn can make available to qualifying retail customers to help with economic development activities. Joe, you want to just maybe talk to those right now for a quick second?
Yeah, I can do that. I think about 4 or 5 years ago, the agency pulled together city administrators and economic development directors from across the membership to have a discussion about if there's a greater role for SEMPA in economic development activities. And one of the outcomes from those meetings is that other utilities were offering incentive rates. And so if you were attracting a new large business to the community, you were trying to retain or even get a local business to grow, we were seeing that some other utilities were offering discounted electric rates. And so the board had a good discussion about that and ultimately decided that there was a role for SEMPA. And so working with Marais and the other 17 members, we developed an economic development incentive program, which for qualifying businesses would offer a 40% discount in energy costs in year one. And then that stair steps down by about 50% a year over 5 years. We've had our first business in Rochester take advantage of it. And the program I thought was well designed because it scaled to equally benefit businesses in Marais and Rochester. And so it really scales by the size of the member. And we look forward to rolling this out and working with the members as that issue pops up. And we're certainly also open to finding other ways that we can work with communities right now on the economic development front. We're even thinking of perhaps adding some information on the agency website, maybe a site inventory, and helping promote sites within the communities as well. And then the other bullet point there is just the large power rates, and those kind of feel like an economic development rate as well. And so those are special rates available to large customers based upon their load factor, their time of use, or their season of use. And I guess I would say that if we can get a lot of benefit from working with one large customer, perhaps the same benefit of working with one large customer that we could of working with hundreds of residential customers. And if we can encourage that large customer to change the way that they use electricity, again, it may reduce the overall demand in our system, provide savings for all of our customers. And so it's a win-win. We can provide an incentive to the business, and the agency and its members get an incentive as well.
I know Great River, back in the day, used to do, like loans, low-interest loans, they had a big program for economic development, which they kind of, especially when they were UPA, and then they kind of phased it out in recent years. But would you consider ever doing something like that, or can you even?
We used to have an economic development loan program that predated me. I started at SIMPA in 1998, and I believe we had an economic development loan program in the late 80s and into the 90s. And then for whatever reason, that program also kind of
all the utilities backed
went away.
out of that. Yeah, I can't.
Yeah.
It had to do with regulatory stuff, but I'm not sure. I never did really understand why.
Yeah.
I thought UPA's program was very effective, and they did a lot of great projects, over the years, and then they just kind of went out of that business,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Yeah, and I will share with you that electric co-ops have access to federal funding that they can loan to businesses through the Red Leg Loan Program. And that is
You don't
something
have-
unique to those cooperatives. It's a great question, and so when we hear about co-ops giving loans to businesses, that's what we think of. We actually, one thing I didn't do when I introduced myself was mention that.
Oh, yeah.
I've been in this position about 3 months now. Prior
Yeah.
to that, I spent 17 years as the city administrator and utility manager in Preston. So another SEMPA member similarly sized to Grand Marais. So I like to think that I kind of bring a member perspective,
Yeah,
although I
yeah,
will
and
say
he does, yeah.
the agency, working inside the headquarters, I will know that everything is member focused in our agency, which is,
Good
I
to hear.
was always told that, but it's so great to see that
actually true.
firsthand as well. So down in Preston, we tried to develop a red light program similar to what the co-op had, and the federal government said that's great, we'll work with you on that, but the local utility has to 100% guarantee that loan. And so in the end,
That doesn't work, yeah.
It didn't work so well. In fact, they wanted us to put up in collateral the full amount of the loan with the federal government.
That's
So
ridiculous, yeah.
in that case, we were in a position where the
Yeah.
utility itself made the loan. And so I know I'm sidetracked here a little bit, but I do like to point out that often when you hear like electric co-ops doing loans, they're actually just loaning out federal money
Yeah.
because
Yeah,
they
okay.
can.
Yeah.
You know.
SIMPA is not a co-op, but it seems very like a co-op, isn't it? Or am I get that wrong?
No, we're very similar. So, I mean, you're familiar with Great River Energy, and, so, yeah, a lot of people that are in rural areas, they're familiar with their distribution co-op, and then we think of it as a G&T, generation and transmission co-op. So if you're familiar with Great River Energy, that serves to Arrowhead,
Right.
we are like GRE, except instead of selling to distribution co-ops, we serve to our city members. Right. So kind of a not-for-profit. We're not organized under the Department of Agriculture, however the co-op system is set up. We are set up through the authorizing legislation from the state of Minnesota.
Yeah. So it's more about the particulars of the governance than the reality of the situation, right? I mean,
Well,
'cause-
and it's a lot of where the retail customers are. Typically, I mean, our members serve the residents of Grand Marais.
Yeah.
So, we serve the load that Grand Marais requires to serve those retail customers. The co-ops typically serve their customers in the rural areas, and they have distribution co-ops instead of cities, and they're getting their power at the wholesale level from what we call the G&T co-op, just like our members are getting their power at the wholesale level from the Joint Action Agency, which for our cities is SIMPA.
yeah.
And so SIMPA is organized as a joint action agency. With my background as a city administrator, I think it feels a lot like a joint powers board, which, I'm not sure if Grand Marais is involved in any joint powers boards. I know the city I live in has a joint powers board that oversees a multi-city wastewater plant. The city I worked for had a joint powers that oversaw a multi-city youth recreational sports organization, and there's a joint powers board for a multi-city bike trail. So basically, it's in our case, 18 cities that come together and own and govern this organization. So it is unique from what an electric co-op is, but it also looks very similar
Yeah.
on the surface.
Yeah, the main distinction is that co-ops and joint action agencies and public power systems don't have investors. The Minnesota Powers and the Otter Tails and the Xcel Energies, they have investors that are expecting to earn a return on their investment. So that's part of their motivation. They are regulated, they are rate regulated by the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission. We are not, and our members are not. We're regulated by our board, and the Grand Marais utility operation is regulated by you folks, as opposed to the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission. Co-ops are self-regulating. They have their own boards like we do. So there's some similarities. There's probably more similarities than differences when you're comparing co-ops and public power. That's kind of how we refer to our, city generation or city utilities as public power.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of similarities there that are maybe a little bit different than how the investor-owned utilities are set up. And investor-owned utilities, or IOUs, is kind of the term that's used to refer to the Xcels and the MPs of the world.
Yep.
Back to economic development, the the rebate or the discount that you offer as an incentive to economic development, is that for kind of for manufacturing only, or would affordable housing fit in that category, for instance?
Yeah, no, that's a good question.
Yeah.
So it isn't limited to manufacturing, but it is limited to the largest 5 or 10 customers in a community, depending on how that is measured. Interestingly enough, affordable housing came up in several of our economic development meetings, and unfortunately.
Topic number one here, that's for sure.
Well, I know. Unfortunately, the role of the electric utilities in affordable housing development maybe isn't as strong as it could be in the way of an incentive. I mean, it even got down to the discussion point, if we offered developers free electricity for their facilities, would that move the needle on whether or not they would build the facility? And it we struggled to figure that out. I know individual utilities, you may also regulate the water and the wastewater here,
We
is
do,
that
right,
correct?
here we do, yeah.
Yeah, and so I know that a number of local electric utility commissions like yours have tried to use infrastructure investments as a way to help incentivize affordable housing development, but the underlying issue remains that somebody still has to pay for that. So if we subsidize that infrastructure across the community, well, then the whole community is helping to contribute and address that issue. But
Well, what it's boiling down to here is, either we subsidize affordable housing or we pay people enough that they can build their own housing.
Yeah.
That's right.
That's sort of the choice. Otherwise, people literally don't have a place to live. And that's what's happening here. And, it's kind of a stark reality. You gotta do one or the other, so
yeah.
you gotta pony up one way or the other. But to me, it would make more sense to address it on the income side, but that's just my opinion. It's a lot easier, less complicated, but. And it's particularly acute here with really high, because of our remote location, we have high construction costs here. So
Right.
anything that can help, most of the action is on the supply side, and anything that could help reduce costs, especially in the first couple of years, would actually be quite helpful, I would imagine.
So just to be clear, this 40% discount on power as an incentive for
1 year.
economic development, who does that go to? Like what sort of an entity?
So that would get passed on to the business. And
What
so-
business though? I mean, what kinds of business, or is it a startup business only, existing business, big business, little business?
Yeah.
What is it?
Yep, so generally, they would be the larger
Big
customers in your community, the big users,
So-
and that
The
could
big
be.
user for Grand Marais, I don't even.
Yeah, I don't even know who it would be.
Hotels, clinic.
Hotels might.
Hospital, I
clinic.
suppose. Well, that's not really
I
a
mean,
business.
my
but-
bill at the service station was kind of high, but,
Yeah.
no, I mean, we
And so-
do use, I like.
Well, that's why I brought up affordable housing, like a
Your lights
large
are on all the
apartment.
time, I mean, hotel,
Grocery store, probably with.
grocery
their-
store with compressors
cooling,
and stuff
yeah.
like that,
Yeah,
that draw.
Preston had a dairy operation, which
Yeah.
was one of the larger
Yeah.
customers.
So you just cut it off top whatever, 5 users, and you say, well, we'll offer those top 10
Well, the
users a
city would know
discount.
what the use is for their customers individually.
Well, I think it's for qualifying loads that are, what's the 10 largest? Well, it's a load
I
that's.
believe it is
as
the
big
10
as-
largest.
At least as big as the 10th largest load of the system.
Yep. And
So-
and then it would be for, go ahead.
Well, but you go ahead.
Yeah, it would be for new construction, so a new business coming in, that would be a large load.
Like putting in electric heat or something, yeah.
Yeah, or an expansion of an existing business that would represent a very large increase in load. Or ultimately, it would also be available to retain a business. So if you had a manufacturing business that was interested in relocating somewhere else for whatever reason, we believe that this discounted energy cost package could be part of a larger package that the community puts together to retain that business. And so those are kind of the 3 umbrellas that you could qualify under.
Right. New load, expansion, or retention.
Yep. And so ultimately, that incentive goes to the local utility commission, which passes it on to the customer, and you get to brand that as your economic development incentive to that customer. Meaning it's not a check from SEMPA to the customer, it's a check from SEMPA to Grand Marais,
Grand-
and then from Grand Marais to the customer.
Wholesale,
So,
yeah.
Check from
again,
Craig to the
you know,
customer.
Be the wholesale buyer and then.
well,
pass it on to
we're a
each-
member-owned organization, and so if we design a program for the members, it's yours to pass on to your
Right.
customers.
Yep.
It's not ours to grant.
Thanks. Clarifying that.
Okay, next slide. So here is kind of our current overall rates. You know, we have a rate structure of demand charges and energy charges that may or may not mean anything to you. But when we look at the overall billings that we have to all of our members and put that in terms of dollars per kilowatt hour, which is shown here on the x-axis, and just look at it over time and compare it to our 2010 rates. And we picked 2010 because after, in 2009, effective for 2010, that was kind of a rate increase that we had. And then we had a period of time where the rates were flat for about 6 years after 2010. So if we were to just look at, had our rates gone up at the rate of inflation, that's the orange line on the screen. And then the blue line represents what our rates actually have done on an overall basis. We got close to catching up to the rate of inflation in 2017, but then kind of back down to where we are now in 2022, comparing to the inflation-adjusted rate. There's a substantial spread between what we've been able to do with our costs, with our rates to our members, compared to at least inflation-adjusted going back to 2010. We just updated the last year of inflation-adjusted to pick up, you know, the big jump in inflation, which is why we went from 0.085 to 0.091, again on the inflation-adjusted rate that, you know, is not our cost. But that spread between where we are now and inflation-adjusted with the inflation rates that we've seen as a country here it's fairly stark at the moment.
So what does it mean that SIMPA's not affected by inflation?
No,
There's a delay, probably.
No, I mean, not entirely. I think it means that some of the resources that we invested in to provide for energy costs are not subject to the inflation that the general economy is. I will say that we are seeing major supply side challenges impacting the utility industry right now. One of the biggest challenges that we're faced with right now is the ability of the railroad to deliver coal to Sherco. That's a hedge that I mentioned against the market prices. So even though we're transitioning out of Sherco, and you know, and we need the time between now and 2030 to build the future renewables that we need, right now we still need the unit to operate effectively, and the railroad can't come up with the staff to run the trains to deliver the coal. So SIMPA and Xcel and a lot of utilities that require the railroad to deliver coal, which is most of the coal plants, we're in the mode of rationing kind of how we consume coal right now to make sure that we have it available for the season that we're entering right now, the summer season, when we expect the loads to be higher. And that there's a cost to that. So
That's probably why they're moving the coal pile out of Taconite Harbor in that closed plant. All of a sudden, I've noticed they're pushing coal around down there.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the plant's.
Yeah, there's a lot piled up there.
Well, they brought in a bunch of
They
coal.
brought in coal.
Right when they closed it down.
Yeah.
Which made you think maybe they were thinking it
Oh, really?
wouldn't stay closed.
Okay.
And now all of a sudden, they're trucking it out of
And I
there.
see it's
so-
moving, yeah.
And they're moving their substation out of the plant site too, so it looks
Okay.
like
Okay.
they're gonna say goodbye to that plant. But
Coal's, it's hard to come by right now, and
Yeah.
and everything that we're hearing from the railroad has to do with train crews. Right.
interesting.
Yep. Next up, and then I'm about done here, I'll turn it over to Joe to wrap up. Debt service, you know, I talked about the long-term commitments and the obligations. Here is our current debt service obligations that we have. You can see that the debt service will drop off significantly in 26 and 27 coming up. That's when the Sherco bonds will be paid off. The bonds for Sherco were set with a 40-year term, back to the long-term commitments. So those will drop off in 2027, and we will be much more debt-free then. Looking forward to that. If we put that on terms of a dollar per kilowatt hour basis, this graph is just pure dollars of bond payments. The next graph expresses that in terms of dollars per megawatt hour, I guess. So on a per unit basis, it still shows that the agency's going to be losing a substantial portion of our cost structure, roughly $20 per megawatt hour, which, should be able to, at some level, translate into rate decreases for the members when that debt drops off. Now, some of that will be added back as we have to make commitments for the renewable generation to replace the Sherco debt. But we still expect that, those, at least from a debt perspective, will be better off when the Sherco bonds are paid off.
And
we'll
that's what these projections are from 27 going
Well, these
forward?
these are debt service projections. So what's not in there right now, because of federal tax structures, entities like SIMPA can't take advantage of the tax incentives for renewable resources. So our current approach to owning renewables is through long-term purchase power agreements with other entities that can take advantage. They have to be taxable entities, that they can take advantage of the tax incentives. And then in theory, they pass through at least a major portion or some portion of the benefits of that tax incentive to us in the way of a lower PPA rate. About the only way that you can try to capture that is to do a request for proposals and try to, get everybody, to get the developers to compete
Yeah.
to give you the best deal. We are working,
That's kinda fishy.
and our National Trade Association is working with legislators to try to get that changed so that we can get access to the same direct pay tax incentives that private developers get access to, so that we then have the choice to maybe invest in these projects on our own if it's a better way to do that.
Isn't Excel, don't they build their own?
They can build their own now, and they're a taxable entity, so they can
Oh,
take
yeah, right.
advantage of the
Yeah.
tax structures. There was a period of time when they were not allowed to own their own, and they also had to purchase through purchase power agreements. But they got those regulations changed so that they could invest themselves in those renewable resources.
So this
And
is-
we're, frankly, we're talking to them right now about participating in some of the future renewables that we've identified.
Talking
We've
to
had a-
Excel or talking to the
Excel.
legislature?
No,
Yeah.
Excel. We've had a great partnership with them in Unit 3, and we're looking at ways that we can continue to work with them to meet our renewable needs
Yeah.
going forward. Yeah. And there, I'm going to turn it over to Joe to kind of
Yeah.
take us on home for the rest of the topics.
So I'll hit a few bullet points here under agency and government relations. First, we'll talk about demand-side management. We've already touched on this a little bit, but largely this is our effort to help our customers use less energy, especially during those peak hours, so that we can build a smaller, more efficient system. Largely, we do that through residential rebates. We've touched on that, and here's just an example of some of the rebates that we offer. Again, these are all branded through Grand Marais Public Utilities and available to your customers right here in City Hall. And they're also detailed on that website, Save Energy in Grand Marais. And I'm not sure if any of you have been there, but it's a pretty neat website that details everything that's available. On the business side, we offer a fairly extensive list of business rebates for lighting, cooling, refrigeration, variable speed drives and motors. And we also, as we mentioned, have Nancy Kelly, who comes to town on occasion and acts as the energy services representative. She is an expert when it comes to energy efficiency. Will work with your customers on a variety of their needs. And here you have a picture of a rebate check for Joy and Company here in town, who, let's see, energy efficient lighting. They did a lighting upgrade here in town. I think I see a familiar face in that photo as well.
A couple of familiar faces.
Yeah.
Yeah, Patrick and Shane own that company.
That's right. We made the check out to the wrong entity, I guess.
Yep. So then a few other member support items that we have. We offer a Solar Choice Community Solar Program. We heard from our members that there were residents in their community who were interested in getting involved in solar in one way or the other, but weren't interested in putting it on their roof. It seemed a lot of those customers were interested in solar for economic reasons. And so we developed a program that allows your customers to reap some of the benefits that they would get from owning solar without actually having to install it on their property. And largely that is done by providing them some price certainty, similar to that which you would get with solar panels. Originally, this was an upfront program where a customer could purchase essentially what appeared to be a share of our solar project down by Owatonna with a larger upfront purchase, but we are now redesigning that program as a pay-as-you-go program as well, so a customer could make an option to pay a little bit more every month on their utility bill initially to kind of lock in a long-term cost for their utilities. We also assist our members with distributed generation, and so when you do have customers that come in and want to put up rooftop solar, We have some experts that can help you work through that process, and then also provide assistance with some of the annual reporting that's required by the state. We have a cybersecurity program, which largely is Ningio educational videos, which I think the city here probably participates in, may or may not, but if you don't, we'd be happy to provide that information to you. These are short, maybe 5-minute cybersecurity videos.
Maybe even less than that,
Yeah, they come out maybe about once a month.
What is this, like, don't click that link?
It is, but they're high.
What's cybersecurity as it pertains to your members?
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead. I mean, I'm a big fan of this program, so I have thoughts on it, but, well, so, I mean, it's really about the employees of the members.
Yeah.
So, you know, we've invested a lot of money, as utility generally have, on the hardware and kind of the external facing kind of defenses with cybersecurity, and utilities like us and you are under constant cyber attack. Well, one of the things that's much harder to deal with in terms of technology is just people being careless about their cybersecurity habits when they get an email with a link or an attachment, you know, that they don't recognize and they shouldn't click on. So these Ningio, and that's the name of the company that develops them, these videos are little vignettes that are based on real life examples of where somebody has clicked on the wrong thing or been careless with some aspect of their cybersecurity hygiene that has resulted in losses, major losses, whether to their company or to them personally. And I think they really leave a lasting impression. And then one of the things that we do is we test our folks. We send out fake phishing emails that, you know, are kind of designed along the lines of the things that people are not supposed to fall victim to, so that we can see if people are paying attention. And to the extent that, you know, they click on something they shouldn't have, we can see whether we're making progress, and we've made progress. I mean, now it's to the point where many months we'll have nobody clicking on something that they shouldn't be clicking on, and that's
Yeah.
what you want.
So that's for SIMPA employees, especially, right? But then who else is it for?
Well, we offer it to all of the employees of the members as well. So all of your city and utility employees can be enrolled in this program, and they would get an email from our staff once a month saying, hey, here's your monthly video. You know, take a few minutes to view this video. And, you know, it's just another service that we can offer our utility members.
Yep.
And
Do you also do the fake phishing?
I think the fake phishing is limited to our staff.
Too bad.
Yeah.
But I mean, you do hear cities, for example, will get ransomware attacks.
Absolutely.
Or I suppose the local, I don't know, wastewater plant or something.
Yep.
Could be.
Police departments, hospitals, all under attack, and it
Yep.
happens.
And most of those attacks that we're seeing on cities, utilities, wastewater plants are coming as a result of an employee action, an employee opening an email. You know, I've witnessed it firsthand in Preston. And so, you know, it seems relatively simple, but these little videos, a few minutes every month, really zero in on that key vulnerability for a lot of small businesses, a lot of cities and utilities.
Yep.
Another kind of interesting thing that we do is we have a pollinator initiative. That was one of our outreaches to the environment. And so we distribute seed packets full of pollinator seed mixes to members that you can share with your customers. And then we also work with some of our members to put in pollinator gardens or monarch way stations or waste rest stops. And so those services are available, and I think we're putting our order in this week or next week. And so I've reached out to all the members and see if they were interested for 2022. We discussed the economic development incentives, and then David just touched on the legislative involvement as well. And so we do have a story to tell, not only in St. Paul, but in Washington, D.C. as well. And the agency wants to help our members do that. And so there is an APPA. So APPA is the American Public Power Association. That's our national association. They do a legislative rally out in Washington, D.C. every February. And SEMPA usually sends a pretty good group out there. I think maybe we had 15 SEMPA members go with, representatives from member communities. And that's a mix of both staff and commissioners as well, and council members. And we have an opportunity out in D.C. We meet with our legislative delegation, and we typically get a meeting room in the basement of the U.S. Capitol, and bring in the representatives and the senators or their staff and discuss issues relevant to small cities and municipal utilities. It's a great opportunity to tell our story, and we're happy to facilitate that for our members. For anyone who's interested in attending, we can help coordinate that visit. And then we have a similar, smaller rally in St. Paul every year with MMUA, which is the Minnesota Municipal Utilities Association. That's our state association. And again, we go to St. Paul and we tell the stories on the state level issues that are important to municipal utilities. And just to kind of wrap things up, I would point you to the SEMPA website, sempa.com. It's got some good information for your customers about the rebates that are available, but there's also a member secure side of it, and I think Mike probably has access to that. And there's quite a bit of information about the agency. Oh, Dave, what's all on there? Our load graphs and I think
Yeah,
an
there's some-
archive of minutes and
Right.
board books.
Board materials, right. There's some real-time load information about what's going on with our system, real-time generation information if you're curious about, okay, what's the mix this minute that's going to sort of Grand Marais. That's all available on the member portion of the website.
Yeah. So I think that brings us to our wrap-up. We might have gone over a few
Well,
minutes.
yeah.
on our
Good
time there, but-
presentation.
Hopefully it's
Really
because
good.
of your questions and not opposed to,
Yeah.
No,
us
no,
droning on. I
we
guess.
kept you past here.
Oh, I certainly
no.
appreciate the back
I
and
can see
forth.
the
and
the newbies are
engagement
full
as
of
well.
questions here, so
We got all the time, so we can,
very well done.
yeah.
Just sort of from a general strategy point of view, you know, you say you offer discounts to large users. I know like Minnesota Power does this for the mining companies up there. It's a little tricky though, isn't it? Because in a way, you're encouraging people to use more power, which is sort of what you don't want to do. I mean, it's sort of like, yeah, here, go ahead, it's free almost. And so use as much as you want. I mean, it isn't really that way, but how do you think about that? Because, you know, when you're saying, for instance, that one of your goals is load reduction, the power that you don't have to produce, and then you're discounting power for people who use a lot, it seems like it's a little
Yeah,
off in some way.
go ahead. I have my thoughts on that, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on that too,
Well,
Joe.
I'm not saying it shouldn't, I'm just
To
curious
add on
what
to
the
that
what
is,
the
like,
philosophy
over the
is.
years, what has been the load growth due to development, economic development, population increase or decrease, certain areas, maybe increase in population, suburbs. I mean, we see growth everywhere I travel. So I mean, you can track your growth load. I mean, what do you see for like predicting that out in the future, knowing that the load you need? And of course, weather depends, you know, hot summers, cold winters, colder winters, hotter summers. So I mean, it's kind of,
There's a lot in all of there, but
Right.
yeah, I mean, we can try to
It's
talk.
complicated.
You want to
Go ahead.
Well, in my mind, there's a distinction between incentivizing somebody that might be an existing customer to use electricity just foolishly and wastefully. And, you know, we're not trying to do that with these programs. But, you know, if you're looking at maybe somebody that's thinking about expanding, you know, that because maybe their business is growing and that might involve bringing jobs into a community, you know, we want to help them to be able to do that as effectively as possible. Part of the incentives, I think, there's a requirement in there that they have to talk to their local utility about available demand-side energy efficiency measures to make sure that whatever expansion they're talking about is done as efficiently as possible. If you're talking about attracting a new load, if you believe that that new business is going to land somewhere, many of our members would have an interest in having that business land in their community for just all of the ancillary benefits associated with having jobs and, you know, people coming into the community. So, you know, that's a plus that, you know, yeah, it's new load, but maybe it's not new load that wouldn't have happened but for the incentive. It's new load that you're trying to get into your community. And for whatever reason, if a community is not interested in pursuing those opportunities, they don't have to use any of these tools. These
Yeah.
are really just tools intended for their activities if they are so inclined.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just thinking if I was number 11 on the 10 heaviest user list, or number 11 on the list, and I want to be 10, maybe I'll just crank up my electricity use so I can get that 40% discount. I don't know. I'm just, it seems like
Yeah.
maybe those things
be
come up,
pretty-
maybe they don't.
That would be-
Machiavellian, but I
that would be an
suppose somebody
interesting
might-
economic
yeah.
analysis.
Might
on
be
that,
somebody
yeah.
in that situation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so,
Pretty
yeah,
unlikely.
and, you know, when we grant, or when through Grand Marais, we give a rebate for somebody to put in a more efficient air conditioner on their house, you know, I'm guessing that customer probably isn't saying, well, I've got a more efficient air conditioner, now I can leave the lights on all night.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
so a lot of it has to do with customer behavior as well. But, you
Right.
know, it is, you actually bring up a very interesting question when it comes to energy efficiency. Utilities are encouraging their customers to use energy more efficiently, but at the same time encouraging new growth, new load growth within their communities. And there's a dichotomy there, I suppose. That's interesting. But yeah, it's been a long-term discussion point, I think, for utilities. But the reality is, as Dave mentioned, the benefits of new housing and new business growth in a community generally far outweigh those energy economic considerations.
Yeah. So then the focus is on just getting those customers to be able to use their electricity efficiently. Yeah. If you believe that they're kind of coming to town anyway, sort of thing, or you want them to come to town.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Been some interesting philosophical questions here.
Yeah, you guys
It
have thought
is-
about,
it
you
is
guys have thought about this.
Economic
Yeah.
development has a lot of philosophical questions that, you know, it's complex.
Right.
Incentives can actually be counterproductive in terms of like tax incentives. History is not good on that, especially in northeastern Minnesota.
Hmm.
You kind of track the bottom feeders.
It kind of
Turns
always, it always kind of, maybe it's always like a 360 thing, even though there's incentives, or even though there's rebates, even though there's tax, whatever. It seems like somebody pays for them somewhere along the line.
Of course, yeah. There's
Yeah.
no free lunch. Yeah, there's
Right,
no
I
free
mean,
lunch.
the user, somebody has to
Yeah.
catch, somebody picks up the slack somewhere.
Yeah, yeah.
That's exactly right.
You just hope that we do it in a smart way, in a positive way, so that it might build economic growth or build population within our city, you know.
What else about SIMPA have we not covered that you're dying to ask?
I don't think there probably is anything.
I still haven't really got the question I asked, the very first question I asked is, how did that actually happen? Maybe you know, I mean, what made Grand Marais say, let's throw in with southern Minnesota instead of Two Harbors and Silver Bay and, well, I know they're special, but, you know, Hibbing.
Well,
and-
Torrance Silver Bay, we know that, but.
Yeah,
I don't
I
know
mean,
if there's a
what was
joint
the
action
history of
up
that?
here,
It
Dave,
was-
is there?
Well, there's a group of utilities that I think have a small joint action agency, but I think they typically just use that to negotiate with Minnesota Power. And there's probably folks watching that, know more about that history
Yeah.
than I do. I've come to learn
It's
that,
more local history I'm interested in. It's like, where did that just, I mean, it just seems so odd. People ask me that all the time. Why the heck does Grand Marais buy their power from
Southern
Minnesota?
well, yeah, I mean, and I don't know that, a lot of it has to do with
Must have been
kind of the
just-
situation at the time.
Yeah, the
And
timing.
we've learned that cities are very independent, and, there's cities that want to be a part of no agency. They want, and there are a
Yeah.
few still
Yeah.
out there, just independent, unaffiliated cities that are out there trying to do their own thing with power supply. I think it's becoming much more challenging to do that, but they're doing it. There are cities that, have banded together with different combinations of cities. I've mentioned we're not the only joint action agency out there. There are cities that buy wholesale power from co-ops. There are cities that buy wholesale power from their investor-owned utilities. It really just has to do with kind of the leadership of the city at the time and the commitments they're willing to make.
But Grand Marais joined in '77, right? Is that right?
Well, Grand
Well, that's
Marais
when-
was part of UMPA, and I guess I shouldn't say UMPA formed in 1977. It couldn't have been much before 77 because the legislation that was allowing joint action agencies was enacted in 1976.
But
I think-
UMPA was probably a little bit more of those northern cities?
UMPA was those 5 northern cities
yeah.
that I mentioned. It was just those 5.
Northern, if you consider
Well, we were
Litchfield.
the-
Well, I recognize who I'm talking to
Sort
here.
of northern.
Yeah, right,
Or
right.
more,
Northern from your
we-
point of
yeah.
view.
Yes.
From Rochester, but,
Yeah, northern from our membership.
No, it's just
right?
interesting.
Northernmost of the group.
yeah, I'm sure it boils down to what made the most sense at the time.
And I
Closest
think,
one was
I
Mora
think,
Yeah.
for us,
I
yeah.
think the United, there's a historian out there somewhere that might know more than me, but I think the United in the UMPA name meant they were buying wholesale from UPA. which was United Power Agent, or Association, I believe.
I mean, way back, I know like in the 20s or maybe even the teens, Grand Marais made their own power, and it was
Well,
like,
exactly.
they're running a new wire
Oh,
to
yeah,
so-and-so's
generator.
house, and I've seen old newspaper articles about that. and-
Right, right.
And the engines they took out over by the harbor not that long ago
But this
were
was,
old railroad locomotive
Locomotive
boilers
motors.
that were converted to electrical generators. They're actually really
so
smart.
UMPA replaced that. We start.
At
buying
some
from-
point, yeah.
And then
at some
Simpa
point,
replaced
yeah.
UMPA.
Yeah, and that's how we-
UMPA and SIMPA merged, and they
That's what
decided
brought
to
us
use
to
the
you,
SIMPA
yeah.
name.
It's a better name. UMPA is just too weird. UMPA.
Yeah, it's, yeah.
At least it wasn't Oompa.
But, right, right. So, but, yeah, so there must have been some situation
Yeah.
where the co-op said, we're not gonna provide for your power, we're gonna focus not on cities, we're gonna focus on our retail or our rural members. I guess I don't know, I'd be
Yeah,
speculating.
yeah.
But they decided, those 5 cities had originally signed a co-ownership agreement to be a part of Sherco 3.
Oh.
So the agreement that we have with Excel Energy to establish the co-ownership percentages of Sherco 3, it is really a 3-party agreement. You've got the SIMPA 13, the UMPA 5, and Excel. But then when the UMPA 5 and the SIMPA 13 merged into the current 18, for all practical purposes, the agreement on Sherco just became a 2-party agreement. But they were kind of, Grand Marais and the other 4 cities were kind of going down the same path, and they said, we're going in the same direction that the other 13 are going. Why don't we combine forces?
Yep.
And I know this because there was actually there was a 20-year history book that was written of the agency. So this process was described in that.
Interesting.
So, yeah.
Thanks so much for coming. It's really interesting.
Yeah,
Everything
thanks a
that
lot.
Well, thanks for having us. It's always nice to get out and talk to our members, and, a couple years of pandemic and not really being able to do this sort of thing it's kind of nice to be able to get back out and
Yeah, that's
and
great.
do this. So
That's great.
happy to show up.
And
I
I
know.
always love coming up to Grand Marais.
Right, well, and I know, Mike travels a lot down here, so when we have an opportunity to come up here, we're eager to do it, and it's a little less traveling he does, and we're happy to.
Means a
happy
lot
get
to us
together.
when people come up here, so. it's-
Yeah, well, we're happy to do it.
You get the one day of nice weather too, which is
Yeah,
good.
that's
you
what
got
we
the
hear.
sun, 'cause
Believe me,
it's
we've been having our share of whatever you've been having down there, probably a little warmer, but it's, oh man, it's been rainy and windy and,
You guys got the wind the other
Yeah,
night.
tough spring for youth sports, for sure.
Yeah.
Yep.
you drive along 35 and there are some significant spots with tree damage down on 35. I don't know if
Yeah.
you, south of Duluth.
Yeah, right around Hinkley, I think.
Holy
Yeah.
cow, yeah, yeah.
It's been crazy.
Hopefully, I don't see that up here when we got north of Duluth,
We
which
didn't
is,
get the high winds that were predicted.
man, we've had more winds in the last 6 months, starting in about the middle of December. There were some winds that rolled through southern Minnesota that were shockingly high, and we've had our share of them, so.
Knocking down your lines?
Yep. Yep, and we lost some more lines in April. I mentioned supply side challenges. We lost, I forget how many structures, maybe 20 structures around Faribault, Minnesota, which is just north of Owatonna on I-35, and we can't get insulators to replace the line. We're looking at November lead time for insulators, so that's a line that's out of service until November, assuming that we get the insulators. So, if you have more storms roll through and take out more lines, now there are areas around that line that are worried about their reliability situation. The National Association is very, very concerned about the southern states where they're subject to hurricanes. They're predicting an active hurricane season. So if there's major outages or damage from hurricanes, transformers, conductor, and now insulators, very, very long lead times on that thing. So there's efforts right now to set up databases where utilities that might have some surpluses can make that available and share that to people that are in need. And we're looking into that hard right now just to find a relatively small number of insulators to replace these insulators damaged it was a tornado that came through just north of Owatonna. So it's just a lot of challenges right now with, I don't know, the country, the world not
Supplies.
making all the things that it used to make. Yeah. All right, well, thank you, folks. We appreciate
Thank you very much.
the time, and if you have any questions, either tomorrow or tonight or next week, let us know or let Mike know, and we'll get you answers. So, all right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Yep.
Are we done?
No, we have one item.
Okay.
Well, yeah, you guys have more business. Do you want us to stick around, or we'll leave, or
You know,
what?
do you have business cards you could leave?
Yes, I do. Yep. Yep. Okay, let's have other business.
EV charging rate.
Yeah, I saw that, yeah. Which is cool. Shane.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, we'll see.
There's just a blip on that. Thank you very much.
Very nice.
Yep, thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Yeah, we should get in touch.
Appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
Likewise.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks a lot.
One of me.
Yeah, appreciate it.
All right, thanks.
Okay, moving on to the next item, EV charging rate. And I suppose I'm just gonna call on Shane to explain this.
Yeah.
Might as well. Yep, go ahead.
So we've been working on this for a while now. This would be a special rate for EV charging at home. And what it is a time of use rate. So it offers half price charging or 5-cent charging during the off-peak hours. But then it's more expensive during the on-peak hours. And there's kind of two goals here. One of them is to support electric vehicles and kind of the climate action plan goals around vehicle electrification. And the other one is looking ahead to a time when the utility has a lot of EVs on its system. And if people follow their patterns of electric usage, if we have a lot of vehicles plugging in at the same time, we'll have spikes in demand. And the goal of this EV charging rate is to flatten out those spikes to encourage people to charge in the off-peak hours instead of the on-peak hours. So right now we're thinking of it as more of a pilot program, see how it works. This is the first time we're using our AMI meters in a time of use configuration.
What's
And,
AMI?
It's the smart meter. Basically, it's
Automated meter infrastructure.
automated meter infrastructure. So there's, right, they're connected to like a.
It's a mesh network of meters that communicate one to another until they get back to home base and tell us the reads. I think once every 10 minutes or
These are the
something.
electric meters being installed all throughout Grand Marais. Yeah, that's what we're talking about.
The new meters that they
Yep.
installed.
Yeah, so they allow for automated reading, but they also allow us to do a lot of other things. And time of use is one of those things where, you know, the meter can know, okay, if it's 11 a.m., this is the rate, 30 cents. If it's 2 a.m., the rate is 5 cents. So it knows, and it would allow us to track this. And we had some trouble getting the AMI network and to talk to our billing software, but we've got them working, and so now this is why we're here today. You might have noticed that the rate structure from the rate consultant is dated from like last winter. Just it's taken us a while to get all of our the billing and the AMI meters to talk, but
So in the service charge, $8 a month, the theory, that's sort of a base charge, right? And so the theory is that if you your house and not telling anybody that you have one.
right.
Yeah. okay.
So the service charge covers the meter. So the way this would work is there'll be a separate meter
Maybe a
from.
separate meter,
Yeah.
just like you would need for off-peak electricity.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's still, overall, it would end up being cheaper for people, so.
It depends on when you want to charge. If you want to
If-
charge during the day, it's
No,
going
I mean,
to be
assuming
more
you're gonna
expensive. But
take advantage of the off-peak.
But you'll see I noted some recommendations for the meter, or for the charger, and one of those is that it's a smart capable charger, so people can go home, plug in at 5, but then time
the
the
charger
meter,
takes care of it, yeah.
time the charger not to
Yeah,
charge the
obviously.
vehicle until 11 p.m. or 12
If you
p.m.
make people get up at 11 to go out and plug in.
It wouldn't
that's not
work,
gonna
would it? No. And there's a lot of chargers out there that people can buy to put in their garage.
Yeah.
So we're thinking if someone's buying an electric vehicle, they're probably getting a level 2 charger anyway. And so if they're putting a charger in, that if we can offer them a reduced rate to see if we can kind of influence their behavior on how they charge, the more vehicles that are on Grand Marais system, the more kind of,
The
future-proof this
cool
is
part in the
almost.
future is you can probably use that capacity to shave peaks too, if you use the batteries in the car. I mean, we looked at this at Sawbill, using the batteries in the car to address peaks, because it's all about peak load. So,
Like distributed storage.
yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
Storage.
So you'd have an agreement where you'd say, I can take back 10% at a certain time, at a peak time, if your car is there and plugged in and not charging.
Yeah.
I can take your batteries down a little bit, because presumably you're not driving right now.
And right now, we're not even going into that kind
Well,
of
I know, that's.
interconnection, because we don't really know how we would manage that, but this is the first step to, what Ford Lightning is an electric truck that's gonna have,
We're gonna see it fast.
vehicle-to-grid capabilities, and so someone could have one of these this year, on our system,
Yeah.
and we wanna, another benefit of this rate is, if it's incentive enough for people to sign up for it, then we can know a little bit more about how many vehicles are on our system, because it will be beneficial to know
If it's
that, because
cheaper.
they are very energy intensive,
If it's
especially the
cheaper, people will
trucks.
sign up for it. Do we need to act on this? Do we need to approve
Ye-
this?
Yep, we're asking for some action on it.
I'll move approval of this rate structure, if that's appropriate at this time. We don't have to have a hearing or anything for this?
No, I think, well, we want to adopt this, so I think if there's any more questions on it,
So you say it's sort of a pilot program?
It is a pilot.
So-
We're gonna limit it to 5 at first, and we're also gonna say that we could change it. This group can change this, depending on how it's working.
Does this I can't remember the rates. We froze the rates this year, and I was gonna talk to those guys about that, but I didn't want to get into that with those guys right now as far as rates, because we did freeze our electric rates from last year to this year, and we'll be talking about new rate increases for next year, or not increases.
Right.
It was interesting to see their graph, because I see they happen to stay the same too, when we stayed the same from 21 to 22, so we
Yeah.
followed them. But if there is an increase, we may have to go back to this. I don't know
Yeah,
if
we
this,
can do that.
I don't know what our house off-peak rate is. Is it 4.5 or is it around 5?
It's 5.5.
It's the same as this then?
Yeah.
So we're just mimicking what we currently have set up right now?
Yep.
And if that changes in the future for next year, we will probably go back and change.
Yeah,
That's-
you would have all the power to change the
Yeah.
EV charging
Yeah.
rate. And I
Okay.
think on the mock-up of the rate from Dave Berg Consulting, he says, you're allowed to change this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we're just trying to we're plugging in an off-peak rate for EV users, and they need to understand that they do have to get their own meter and consult with an electrician that then gets things installed correctly.
Yeah,
So
we
then
would-
we inspect that to make sure it's been installed correctly.
We'd be asking them, they handle the installation and the meter socket. We'll be providing the meter.
Right.
The $8 fee covers the cost of the meter for
Okay.
us. And then, yeah, it's required that they, just like our solar interconnection, it's required to be inspected by the state electrical inspector.
Okay.
And then once we see that, and we don't have like an application system set up or anything, but once they're inspected, then they're good to go, and we plug the meter in, and
Then they're online with the meter, and then it's functioning and working.
yep, and the meter will be programmed for
Should
this
be a-
time of use rate.
Real good thing for you to go on WTIP and talk about, so people know about it, otherwise they're not gonna really know about it.
Yep, pending approval, we'll,
Yeah.
I'm
We'll
sure be
help
doing
them
that.
Push that along.
There's a motion on the table.
We need a second.
Just one.
Yeah,
more-
keep
yes.
Go ahead, no, go ahead. You
Um,
got a question?
Just, is there, so it's a pilot program, how long does it last? Are you gonna stop and reevaluate after some
know.
some
That's
date?
up to us.
Yeah, we didn't put a timeline on it.
But it seems like there should be, I don't know, a year or 6 months or something. We should be taking another look at this. How's it working? Is it people sign up for this? Is they think it's a good deal? What's the feedback?
Yeah,
Right.
and maybe I would be able to give you kind of some updates on how many people have signed up for it.
Right.
And if we have 50 people that are trying to sign up for it, well then, okay,
Right.
but I don't think that's gonna be the case. I think we're gonna have to try to get 5 people to sign up for this within a year.
Okay.
I don't know how many electric vehicles are in Grand Marais right now.
Right.
We can't track who's charging at our stations.
Yeah, it's
We just
probably
know they're
more than you
charging. We
think,
don't know
I-
their origin.
There's a few, but I don't know if they're in the county also, so.
Right.
Yeah.
We
I'm
want,
right.
we,
You had like 11 in the county?
This is
There
gonna
are-
come fast.
There
though.
are 16 registered in the county, but again, we don't know if they're in
Yeah.
the city.
Yeah.
We just know they're in the county.
It's gonna change fast. Norway's approaching 80% electric vehicles now.
Yeah, and.
Well, the
people-
rural area, I think is gonna be, might skew that a little bit unless it's just day tripper. I mean, you know what I'm saying? I think rurally, it might be slower than, in the city, in the bigger cities, but it's hard to say.
But this will apply to people who come up from the cities with their electric vehicle. They may not be registered.
Well,
Locally.
this
They
would,
also wouldn't get this
They
rate.
wouldn't, yeah.
this would
they
be
wouldn't get this
PUC
rate.
customers.
Yeah.
But-
The only way they'd get this rate is if they happen to stay at a friend's house who had a meter from the city plugged into their built house that was
Friend
getting the
pays, yeah.
off-peak, they could plug into that off-peak
No,
rate.
I'm thinking, maybe I'm confused here, but I'm thinking of people who don't stay here in the winter, but they come up and live here in the summer.
Oh, well, people who aren't, but if they're a PUC customer and they sign up for this rate, then it would apply to them.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, well, I think it's great.
It's great.
So
There's
I think
no
what you,
risk.
you know, you already, you listed in here that you're initially seeking out 5 participants, and this is, yeah, we'll just see how it goes, okay.
Yeah.
Can we just get
Yeah.
like a report back in 6 months or whatever?
Absolutely.
Yep.
And you'll likely, as soon as we get someone signed up for it, you'll see it in my weekly update. Because if someone signs up, I'm going to say, yes, this is it.
Okay.
Someone signed up for our EV rate. So.
Very good.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it'll be exciting.
But yeah,
Okay.
I can surely report back.
Second the motion, by the way.
Okay, so we have a motion, we have a second, all in favor?
All right.
Aye.
Aye.
One second. Trucks.
Yep.
Can I get this for my electric bike that I rode down here at this meeting?
Sure.
Plug in a level 2 charge.
I should just put it on a timer, because if I'm getting
So-
off peak now, I should put
Okay,
it on
well,
a timer.
Thanks.
Thanks,
Appreciate
Shane,
it.
appreciate that. And this will conclude our meeting. Motion to adjourn?